Welcome to the debate. When metallurgists talk about purifying gold, there is a very traditional expectation of how the process works. You put the raw ore into a crucible, you apply a massive, intense source of heat.
And that active thermal energy simply burns the impurities away. Right.
Exactly. The heat is the active agent.
But if you step into the world of complex chemical extraction, that crucible entirely fails you.
How so?
Well, when you have impurities that are structurally bonded to the gold at a molecular level, you could apply all the heat you want. You'll melt the gold, sure, but you're just melting the impurities right along with it.
You just melt everything together.
Right, you have to surgically break those chemical bonds first, otherwise, the heat is completely useless.
In that exact tension, that clash between active applied external energy versus internal structural detachment is really the battleground of our discourse today. We're examining a deeply profound piece of spiritual source material that outlines the mechanics of how the human soul achieves ultimate purity.
The actual literal mechanics of it, yeah.
Right. And the explicit tension in the text revolves around the primary engine of this purification. Is it the active, continuous practice of cognitive meditation, the Yad Ki Yatra, or is it the rigorous structural process of internal detachment, the achievement of nastomoha?
Which is a massive distinction.
It is. And I will argue that active meditation, the uninterrupted remembrance of the Supreme Father, is the primary and dynamic driver. This direct cognitive link provides the literal might required to incinerate the karmic debts of past lives.
Well, and I maintain that profound internal detachment, severing the Moki Rag, is the fundamental prerequisite and the true mechanism of purity. Without first dismantling the structural ties to the physical world, any attempt at active meditation is inevitably hijacked by Maya.
Let's get right into the mechanics of this active purification then, because the text builds a very specific causal framework. We are dealing with souls that have traversed a cycle of 84 births.
A massive expanse of time.
Exactly. And the premise is that the soul has degraded over this vast expanse, accumulating what the text calls vikarma, or burdensome, impure actions. But the solution presented isn't a complex philosophical deconstruction.
No, it's quite direct.
The phrasing is aggressively simple, actually. Sirf baap ko yaad karna hai. Only remember the father. Think about the physics of resonance. When you have a degraded, low-frequency object, and you expose it to a supreme, absolute high-frequency source from Paramadam.
The supreme abode.
Right, the lower frequency is forced to align. The intense cognitive connection of yoga acts as that high-frequency influx. The burning away of impurities, the vikaram vinash, is a direct mechanical result of maintaining that frequency.
But
It doesn't ask the student to manually scrape away the rust of half a cycle of body consciousness before making the connection. The connection itself does the scraping.
That's a nice theory, but you are describing a perfectly sterile laboratory environment where resonance transfers without interruption.
Okay.
But we have to look at the actual environment the soul operates within. The text is incredibly stark about this. It doesn't treat Maya as passive friction, it treats Maya as an active, predatory, disrupting force.
It certainly does, yeah.
The text explicitly warns, Maya ase babaki yad bula deti hai. It literally forces forgetfulness. So if we look at the mechanics of how this forgetfulness happens, we see it travels along established neural and spiritual pathways. This is the Moki Rag, the vein of attachment.
Which the text acknowledges as a major vulnerability. Absolutely.
It is the only vulnerability that matters, because if you have a highly conductive vein of attachment tying your intellect to your family, your status, your wealth, or, your own body, your high-frequency resonance is going to instantly ground out.
Do you think it just shorts the circuit?
Completely. Energy follows the path of least resistance. If you haven't done the surgical work to sever those attachments, actually achieving nashtamoha, your attempt at the Yad Ki Yatra is fundamentally compromised.
But
You might generate a brief spark of connection, sure, but the heavy gravity of the physical world will pull your intellect right back down. The detachment has to happen structurally before the resonance can be sustained.
See, I think you are underestimating the sheer force of the nasha, the spiritual intoxication that this remembrance generates. If we assume that human effort alone is required to sever the mohaki rug, we run into a paradox.
What paradox?
Well, a degraded soul lacks the power to cut its own chains. It's sort of like asking someone trapped in quicksand to pull themselves out by their own hair.
That's a bit reductive.
But it's true, the power to achieve Nashotamoha has to come from outside the physical system. When the intellect connects to the supreme, the influx of pure energy provides the psychological anesthetic and the spiritual strength to actually let go of those worldly attachments. The resonance doesn't ground out, it actively disintegrates the conductive pathways of Maya.
But, okay, if that influx of energy was automatically sufficient to disintegrate the pathways of Maya, the spiritual effort wouldn't be described as a constant, grueling battlefield.
It's still an effort to maintain the connection, though.
But the text explicitly demands that a student must develop the firm realization of needing to become pure. That requires an independent intellectual decision. You have to recognize the world as a place of sorrow before you genuinely seek the connection to a place of peace.
Right. Knowledge precedes yoga.
Exactly. If your intellect is still secretly finding comfort in the physical realm, your radio receiver is tuned to the wrong frequency. You can't pick up a signal from Paramdam if your dial is still locked onto the drama of the physical world.
Which brings us to the most visceral reality of the physical world, which is the body itself. The text does not shy away from the absolute brutality of the physical vessel in this final stage of the cycle.
Far from shying away, it forces the student to look at it directly. It defines the body as Purani Chandi, old skin.
Yeah.
It confronts the biological reality of disease, decay, and inevitable suffering head-on.
And this is exactly where the necessity of Yogbal proves its dominance over mere intellectual detachment. Let's talk about the biological imperative of pain.
Okay.
When a human being experiences acute physical trauma, say excruciating joint pain or a failing organ, consciousness naturally collapses inward. It localizes precisely on the point of suffering.
Of course. That's biology.
The biological alarm bells are deafening. In that moment, simply telling yourself intellectually, I am a soul, I am not this body, is overwhelmingly insufficient. The biology will override the philosophy every single time.
Well, it's because you are treating detachment as a philosophical band-aid rather than a fundamental reallocation of identity.
I am treating it as a state that requires active fuel to maintain. What does the text actually prescribe for this localized suffering? It doesn't just say detach.
It says,
It instructs the student to stabilize the condition through yoga ball. The exact directive is to consider oneself a soul and remember the Father despite the bodily pain.
yes, despite.
The despite is the crux of the mechanics. The resilience to endure a rotting vessel without descending into psychological despair comes entirely from the continuous active influx of supreme energy. The Yad Ki Yatra acts as a dynamic shield.
A shield against the pain?
Yes, it's a cognitive override that pushes back against the biological alarm bells. You aren't just ignoring the pain. You are displacing it with a higher frequency of consciousness.
I don't disagree that Yogbal provides strength, but I deeply question the sequence of operations you're proposing here. Have you ever actually tried to establish a supreme cognitive link while your body is screaming in agony?
It's extremely difficult, yes.
It is extraordinarily fragile. The underlying psychological state must already be one of profound apathy toward the physical form for that connection to hold.
Apathy?
Detachment. Apathy to the suffering. The text demands that we fundamentally reallocate our identity based on structural truth. We are souls merely wearing a temporary costume to play a part in a vast drama.
Right, playing a part.
Managing the decay of this Purani Chamdi without developing attachment or its inverse, despair, requires a structural tearing away from half a cycle of conditioning. You cannot apply yoga ball effectively if you still secretly believe you are the body that is hurting.
But human consciousness abhors a vacuum. You cannot simply empty yourself of physical identification through sheer willpower. The text solves this by implying a brilliant simultaneity.
How so?
It instructs students, chalte pierte samjo ki hum baba ke bache hain. While walking, moving, acting in the physical world, maintain the active overlay of spiritual identity.
Right. Karma yoga.
Exactly. You are continuously moving through the friction of the world, interacting with other heavily conditioned souls, managing your own physical decay, but the active generation of remembrance provides the insulation.
Insulation, maybe.
You don't retreat to a cave to sever your ties and then connect. The connection itself is the solvent that dissolves the ties while you remain in the world.
You call it a solvent, but I look at the text's emphasis on the knowledge of the world's destruction, and I see a very different mechanism at play.
The destruction of the old world.
Right. Why does the text constantly remind the student that this is the end of the cycle? Why emphasize the impending Mahabharata war? It is providing the ultimate logical imperative for detachment.
To create urgency.
To force the intellect to comprehend that the entire physical infrastructure, the old tree of humanity, is objectively doomed. How can you maintain attachment to a rotting tree that is already slated for the fire?
Well,
the detachment is driven by the cold structural reality of the timeline. The yoga is secondary to the realization that the physical world is functionally obsolete.
I have to challenge that framing. The knowledge of the world's destruction isn't designed to induce cold, analytical apathy. It is designed to induce an intense, burning urgency for connection.
But the detachment happens first.
No, listen to the phrasing. The text explicitly says, before the war, take your full inheritance from the Father. The inheritance, the sovereignty of the pure, future world, is not secured by realizing the old world is ending.
Then how is it secured?
This absolute necessity of connection brings us to the ultimate test described in the material, the final moments of a soul's incarnation.
Ah, the antikal. Yes, the ultimate bottleneck of spiritual effort.
Precisely. The text reinterprets a deeply ingrained spiritual concept, Antikal Jo Shiv Baba Simari, remembering the Supreme Father in the final moments.
Right.
The text lays out that maintaining this intense cognitive focus as the physical body shuts down is what secures the transformation from a degraded human state into a pure deity state. This is the absolute culmination of the Yad Ki Yatra.
It is the final test, certainly.
Think about the sheer cognitive muscle required to hold a singular, supreme target in your mind while your biological systems fail. If structural detachment were the primary engine, the final test would simply be a state of serene emptiness, a peaceful void. Instead, the final test is a hyper-specific, immensely focused act of cognitive targeting. This proves that building the muscle of active remembrance is the core purpose of the entire endeavor.
But you are isolating the final remembrance from the brutal conditions required to actually achieve it. You are looking at the arrow hitting the target while ignoring the wind, the gravity, and the tension of the bow.
What do you mean?
What does the text say immediately alongside that instruction? It lays down a devastatingly strict condition. It states that during this final remembrance, absolutely no other worldly relations should be remembered.
True. None. That is the very definition of uncompromising, absolute internal detachment.
Yes, but the detachment is in service to ensuring the arrow hits the target.
And I argue the arrow can only be fired because the detachment is absolute. Let's dive into the mechanics of why that is, specifically by looking at the concept of being master knowledgeful.
Okay.
The text links knowledge with light and yoga with might.
The lighthouse and might house concept. Both powers are required.
Exactly. So what is the function of the light? What does this knowledge actually do mechanically? The text explains that master knowledgeful souls recognize the true, insidious nature of Maya.
Right.
It uses these brilliant, evocative terms to describe Maya's nature, chum-chum and rim-jim. The deceptive sparkle, the alluring bells and whistles of the physical world. Let's think about the psychology of that sparkle.
It's very deeply ingrained.
Human biology is hardwired over millions of years, or half a cycle of body consciousness, to seek comfort, pleasure, and safety in the known physical realm. Maya leverages this perfectly.
It does.
To become master knowledgeful, you have to use the light of knowledge to dissect that sparkle and recognize it as poison. You have to intellectually deconstruct your own evolutionary conditioning.
And if you don't?
If you haven't done that excruciating work, if you haven't structurally detached your intellect from the chum-cham of the world, your final moments won't be focused on the Supreme Father. The biological panic of death will cause your intellect to desperately grasp at whatever physical attachments you failed to sever.
That is a phenomenal breakdown of the light. But let's look at how light and might actually interact here. The text explicitly states, Gyan hai light or yog hai might. Knowledge is light and yoga is might. Both must be complete.
Yes.
But they serve very different mechanical functions. Light illuminates the illusion. It exposes the chum-chum as a trap. It shows you the rotting nature of the physical body.
It shows you reality.
It reveals that you are standing in a burning building. But light alone does not possess the kinetic energy to transform the soul. Understanding that you are in a burning building does not miraculously teleport you to safety.
Well, obviously not.
Right, if you only have light, you are just a deeply insightful philosopher burning to death. It is the might of yoga, the active, powerful influx of pure energy from the Supreme, that actually alters the soul's frequency and moves it out of danger.
I see what you're saying, but
Detachment clears the runway, I will grant you that. But remembrance is the engine that actually lifts the plane off the ground.
that is a beautiful metaphor, but let's follow the physics of it. A plane with its engines running at absolute maximum thrust will never take off if the landing gear is still chained to the tarmac.
Okay.
That is the reality of the Moki Rag. It is a literal chain bolted into the very foundation of human psychology. You can sit in meditation and attempt to generate all the thrust you want. You can rev the engines of Yad Ki Yatra until they scream.
But the power?
But if you haven't applied the meticulous light of knowledge to systematically break every single chain of attachment, to your body, to your family, to your ego, you will just burn out your engines on the ground.
I mean,
That isn't a passive byproduct of engine thrust. It requires stepping out of the cockpit and physically breaking the chains before you even attempt takeoff.
Without that internal severance, the peaceful ascent of remembrance you describe is simply an illusion.
Okay. If we follow the physics of the metaphor, I would argue that the sheer exponential force of the thrust from the supreme abode is what eventually snaps the chains. The energy overpowers the structural bonds.
Just rips them out of the ground?
Yes.
If remembrance organically created this detachment, the text wouldn't need to mandate that a spiritual gathering, a Sangatan, must specifically focus on the rigorous effort of remaining soul-conscious.
Exactly. The fact that students in the text openly complain, Baba, Maya doesn't let us remember, proves my point entirely.
How so?
It proves that attempting remembrance without first prioritizing the grueling work of detachment is a losing battle. Maya's chum-chum will always outcompete a weak spiritual connection if the internal structural ties haven't been systematically dismantled. You cannot outpower Maya with a compromised conduit.
Well, it seems we are constantly circling the core paradox of this profound material, looking at the exact same mechanism from two completely inverse perspectives.
I suppose we are, yeah.
To summarize where my argument lands, I see the text outlining a deeply dynamic, active methodology. The soul is in a severely degraded state, heavily burdened by the dense karmic gravity of an entire cycle.
Right.
The primary mechanism to reverse this density is the active cognitive connection to the Supreme Father, the Yad Ki Yatra. This continuous influx of high-frequency energy acts as a literal might. It is the solvent that burns away the impurities, disintegrates the karmic debts, and provides the essential resilience needed to endure the severe suffering of the physical vessel.
And your view on the light?
Knowledge acts as the light to orient the soul, but it is the active connection that actually drives the transformation, ultimately securing the sovereignty of a pure world in those critical final moments.
Right. And, well, my position remains rooted in the structural realities presented by the material. True purity demands the uncompromising surgical removal of all worldly attachments. Nashta moha.
The breaking of the chains.
Exactly. The physical body, the biological imperatives, and the deceptive allure of Maya are incredibly powerful, well-established forces.
They will continuously short-circuit any attempt at meditation if left unchecked. Therefore, the fundamental prerequisite is using the light of knowledge to expose the illusions of the physical world and intentionally severing the veins of attachment. Without this rigorous, often painful, internal detachment, the final test of singular focus is mechanically impossible to pass.
Well, despite the friction in our framing, thrust versus chains, applied energy versus structural bonds, there is a profound point of convergence in how we both read this text.
I think so, yes.
Both of these mechanisms are ultimately in service to a singular, monumental shift in human identity, moving entirely away from body consciousness to existing in a pure state of being Dehi-Abhimani.
We are in absolute agreement there. The text makes it entirely clear that identification with the physical form is the root cause of all degradation. Achieving the realization of the self as a pure soul is the non-negotiable requirement for the ultimate inheritance.
It's just a question of sequence.
Right. The intellectual tension simply remains on the sequence of operations, whether active remembrance naturally produces this detachment, or whether rigorous detachment is the only thing that makes uninterrupted remembrance functionally possible.
It is a remarkable, almost terrifying tightrope the spiritual student is asked to walk, navigating the intense, localized suffering of a decaying physical reality, while simultaneously attempting to maintain a crystalline, uninterrupted connection to a supreme, non-physical source.
It's no small feat.
It requires an extraordinary synthesis of both the light to see the illusion and the might to actually overcome it. We've thoroughly explored the dynamics of the Mo-Ki Rag and the Yad Ki Yatra, but, the source material is dense with further implications.
There is certainly far more to unpack, particularly regarding the psychological nuances of how the 84 birth cycle impacts different souls, and how that specific karmic history dictates a soul's capacity to even grasp the concepts of light and might.
Absolutely. The variables are immense. We encourage you to return to the source material yourself, examine the mechanics of these concepts, and explore how this delicate balance of active spiritual connection and surgical internal detachment resonates with your own intellect and experience.
Figure out which side of the equation works for you.
Exactly. Because ultimately, whether you approach purification by trying to incinerate the impurities with the overwhelming heat of a crucible, or by painstakingly breaking the chemical bonds holding the rust in place, well, the gold must still be purified. The process demands nothing less than total transformation. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.